deputy city managers with the city of Park City, and we are here to have a conversation and do Q&A and talk a bit about the proposed Gordo. We call it the Gordo, but it's technically the Park City Soils Management Facility that we're talking about doing at the Gordo site, which is, as you all know, around the corner here over at 248 and the Richardson Flat intersection. So maybe before we go any further, we'll just go around and everybody introduce themselves after what I just did.
Great. I'm Brett Nicholson. I'm a consulting engineer that has been designing solid waste facilities and practicing in that space for almost 35 years. So I'm the design engineer for this project.
Quinn, the Public Utilities Director for Park City. So I'm responsible for providing water to the community.
And I'm Jonathan Weidenhammer. I'm the Economic Development Director for the city. Matt and I are part of the project management team, so I sit between David and council and actually building projects on the ground.
Matt Twombly, Senior Project Manager, Sustainability. Work with Jonathan on projects for all kinds of projects for the city, from trails to streets to stairs to, buildings, the Mark, the library, all over the board.
I'm Lola Beetle-Broggs. I own some property in Park City and I live in Browns Canyon. I worked for Recycle Utah for many years, and our dream was that we would actually have a facility where you're planning to put it. And so I was excited. And then I heard about this facility and I got kind of de-excited. So I'm here to find out if I can ratchet up my excitement level.
Hi, Tiger Shaw. I'm President and CEO of US Ski and Snowboard, right down the bike path here, and very interested in the project.
Max Dwellian, Park City Council.
Emma Przemka, Park City's community engagement team.
Andy Bierman, Park City Mayor, and I just wanted to thank you to all of you for coming out today, and we look forward to hearing your questions and talking through this.
All right. My name is Jillian Bauer. I'm the High Performance Director at the USE team.
Hattie Frechette, dual purpose. I live in Park City Heights, and I also work at US Ski and Snowboard.
Carol Mora, Executive Director at Recycle Utah.
Linda Jager, Community Engagement Manager for Park City Municipal, and thanks again for coming today.
This is great. I'm excited for us to have more of a conversation, but we're going to start out with Jonathan, at least just giving a high-level project overview for those of you who haven't heard it 6 times already, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I mean, typically I do this and I sit down and I give we extracted 16 million tons of ore and we left behind mine tailings from the Montage through Old Town all the way out this way. And every single project any of us do, whether it's Max putting a deck in his backyard or the city turning over a street, we run into mine impacted soils. I'm happy to talk about that mining legacy if people want to hear it. I don't know that we all do. I think we all understand that. So I think we can just kind of move on. In 2010, the city had been hauling soils to Richardson Flat, which sits just across the road here, for all our projects for years and years and years. And the mines company and the federal government made a deal together that precluded us from doing that in the future. And so we were in the process of building a series of community projects, including tunnels at Bonanza Drive and at Comstock Drive over to the school campus and the Public Works project. And we had 35,000 cubic yards of bevel exempt soil on our hands. So let's talk about what bevel exempt soil is just quickly, because I keep saying it. And I think we want to make sure we have a clear understanding of what it is. What it is mine tailings. It's low in toxicity or low in hazardous. It's not hazardous at all. It's in fact high volume, really heavy mine tailings, but it's not hazardous. And so there's an exemption given through the federal government that we can haul, anybody who has bevel exempt soils can haul them to an appropriate facility. So the closest appropriate facility really right now is out in the West Desert. And since 2010, the city has been pursuing, with everything we have, a place to put those 35,000 cubic yards that we have, plus future projects that we know we're going to run into. That's streets department, that's public works. Every shovelful of soil that Cliff turns over, he's got to try to figure out a place to put it. And we have affordable housing projects we need to do. So we have a long-term future ahead of us of projects we need to address as well. But we've been unable to find a deal that works for the entire region, that works for the federal government, that works for the county. And we haven't been able to find an entry back into Richardson Flat. It continues to be closed down. And so the city council has discussed this idea that putting a soil repository in town is a good interim solution to it. It balances many legs of our stool for the community. Socially, it doesn't take soils out of our town and haul them to another community. Environmentally, we're going to deliver a repository that's Class A, like top of the food chain in terms of its science, in terms of how it's lined, how it's protected from groundwater, how it's really containing any leaching. It's really like top of the food chain from a science standpoint, what the DEQ and the EPA thinks is the right thing to do. Fiscally, the idea that we would haul this very heavy, low contaminant soil to the West Desert, we're talking about $21 million between the projects we already have and the projects we know we have in the immediate future. And we can build this soil management facility here for about $3 million, with another $500,000 to operate it, insure it, test the groundwater for the next 30 years. And then the box we're working on right now is really engaging with the community. Talking to people about how they feel about it is the right project. And so we've been engaged with everybody over the last 45 days or so. Where we've been is that we've started the permitting process with the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. They receive their authority to permit and consider things like this from the EPA, the federal government. And in many ways, we've checked all those feasible boxes. It's likely we can get a permit from the UDEQ. We've just completed the public engagement process with them. We've got a few more technical things to work through, but it's likely we can get a permit to do it. And so really right now what the council is asking us to do is engage with our stakeholders, our public, our neighborhoods, our business folks, and try to inform them to the degree we can about the details of the project, about the science behind the project, the pros of the project, and then this, is it gonna hurt our groundwater? Do we have concerns about hauling? Are there airborne particulate matters we have to be concerned about? So we're happy to talk about a lot of those things today, and talk to you about our approach to management of the soils from the sites of excavation from where they might come from, to how we would haul them and do that safely, and then how we would turn them over and put them into the repository, the holding area, and then how we would operate and manage that facility in the short term and in the long term. So I'm sure I missed a million things. I didn't read any of my notes that I always try to do. What would you like to add to that, David?
The thing that keeps coming up, frankly, that we have, a lot of this is about language, right, and nomenclature. And what are we saying when we say certain things? You hear people talk about toxic waste. We hear about contamination. What do those things really mean? And I think it's super important that we're very, very clear, to the degree it's possible, about those terms, right? And when we talk about the soils that are coming out of the places where the city is doing construction projects, the Penza Park area, probably over close to the PCMR resort base at some point, where there's a potential housing project, et cetera, those soils are mine impacted. So there's elevated levels of lead and arsenic in particular in those soils in places. This foot of soil over here could have a really elevated level of those metals. Over here, right next to it, could have no elevation of those levels. And so it's this crazy aggregated or disaggregated level of elevated levels that we're dealing with. And the way that the EPA said, you know what, you guys can deal with that, you just need to sort of treat it in an aggregate sense, treat it all as basically this low toxicity, high volume waste. But we absolutely consider it contaminated, even though there are probably parts that aren't, right? So to be as safe as possible, the goal is, and the approach has been, consider it all contaminated, but not to the level where it's considered to be toxic material. Now, do you want to go out and grab a handful of that soil anywhere and rub it in your eyes and your face? Absolutely not. Like, that's a bad idea. That's bad, right? classified and analyzed is that so long as you don't do things like that, this is not soil that if you are walking by it, it's somehow going to poison you. It's not nuclear waste product that is somehow in the air and affecting, your cellular or your tissue. So we just want to try to be as clear about that as possible. And yeah, Lola.
So you say lead, arsenic, is there any mercury from the ore refining process?
That is
A good question.
a good question.
So there's probably all sorts of trace
Some.
minerals
Yeah.
that are metals associated with it, whatever ore they were processing. So it's probably in there. I think the lead and arsenic are the primary constituents of concern.
They're really the main ones. But yeah, there's certainly like other heavy metals that were involved. But from the cities and I think the regulatory agencies' perspectives, those are the ones that matter.
Could I interject something
Please.
here? So part of this is an evolution over time, right? From our 100 years ago mining and everything else. What can y'all see from here? What this is a picture of a tailings pond that used to be in Park City. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. I've never seen this until recently, the past 30 days, I think, for the meeting we had at Park City Heights. I knew in general that there were tailings there, but this whole area, this is 248, this is what, the arts and culture. So everything down basically east of there along 248 was a humongous tailings impoundment. So it wasn't like there was a trace of tailings. These are dozens of feet of tailings. So this is where it started. This is a 1953 air photo. So what that, in my mind, turned into, what you see here are various OUs, right? This is everyone's, well, maybe everyone's not, I shouldn't generalize. The entire area out here, Richardson's Flat, everything from basically I-80 all the way up along 248 into Park City. This is an existing map of contaminated soil. So a lot of people aren't thinking about that, but the rail to trail, this whole swath of soil has been contaminated by Silver Creek, or what used to be Poison Creek. And the reason it doesn't run neatly down the center, historically the folks in the area farming, they took water off that, so they had a series of canals in different areas, so that's why this thing spread out so far. So just to give an idea how far this material reaches, and then also it's in Park City. Yeah. So in Park City actual, this is the repository we're talking about. In Park City actual, this entire area is also mapped as contaminated soil, and that constitutes the soil ordinance zone or whatever.
Soils ordinance.
Yeah, so one last thing, this blue overlay here, you know Bill Laughlin, you know Bill. He's been working with the city, with Clint, on a variety of groundwater issues for 20 years? Before you got there, he was probably working with the city, right?
Yeah.
So this is in general, your recharge area?
That looks like this.
It's the drinking water source protection.
Part of the source water protection.
Yeah, so without getting into the weeds on any of that, a lot of this area of contaminated soil lies within this. That's the reason for this Gordo, for lack of a better word, repository outside. There is no groundwater source associated with this. And it's still within the soil district, so it doesn't set things on its ear. So this is just a little quick background of sort of how the genesis of the waste, right?
Since you're up, why don't you talk a little bit about the
Where the soil
repository
is.
itself and the 2 cells and how they
Alright.
get close to the site?
Since I made the mistake of showing a little initiative. So this is the actual site itself, right? And initially, no one knew what the use was gonna be here. So it's like, wham, here's the entire site, let's see what we can do with it. So initially, this cell here was located up here, Then it got moved around, public utilities, been pretty rough on folks with what they wanted. This also triples a space for Recycle Utah, and also part of the background, I'm a local, I've been here for about 30 years, so before Carolyn was at Recycle Utah, and before Lola volunteered there, I was on their board for 10 years. So I've been laying out a Recycle Utah place on and off for 10 years. None of it was here, but anyway. This cell was originally up here. This cell number 2 area is 35,000 cubic yards of soil that's been hauled there over the past 10 years. So it's the same type of waste we're talking about with everything else. The city got shut out of Richardson's Flat and were somehow able at that time to get dispensation from the state to store material here. In my conversations with the state, this sort of fell through the crack. They're like, oh yeah, we remember that. Well, it wasn't supposed to be permanent, so this is a temporary storage facility. This has to be rectified one way or another. So the idea is you can't excavate here, so you might as well construct a repository as close to the existing material, move it as short a distance as possible, contain it there, and if advantageous, you could do a smaller cell on the side. This is very small in total volume. It will never address all these other soils. This will address, specifically when I got involved, it was a 35,000 yards that are on the ground, and it's not an aligned facility. It just has a soil cover on it.
So what kind of cover will be on top of the cell number 1?
So, better question is what liner is going to be under it.
Okay, good.
That's what you meant, right?
I want to know what it looks like from the bottom and the top.
Okay, so from the bottom, there's a GCL material, which is a synthetically encapsulated clay that replaces 2 feet of compacted clay liner. So if you had normally 2 feet of clay, which is 1 times 10 to the -7th, which is a measure of permeability, the GCL would equate to 2 feet of clay to start with. Then on top of that, there's 60 mil HDPE. So on one hand, you know, when you put plastic in the landfill, you're saying it's not going to degrade, and those are the thin bags. This is the next layer is a 60 mil HDPE that's thermally welded. Then on top of that, there's a protective layer that's a geonet, if you will. Then you put the soil in, and by virtue of the permitting, whatever you put as a bottom liner, you have to put as a top cap so you don't create a bathtub. So the most important feature of this whole thing really is the top cap. And it's sloped for a reason so that there's no way water, even if there happens to be a badger hole, is what I heard on the radio, if there happens to be a badger, create a hole at the top, there's no way water ponds to the point where it actually induces flow. So it'd be the same thing on top, and then 2 feet of soil. So it's sort of belts and suspenders. The reason we went this way rather than just like a stipulated consent agreement, which can happen. I mean, and not that that's a terrible solution to anything. Park City Heights has basically collected all the contaminated soil, dug a hole, put it in, covered it with soil, which is infinitely better than the condition things are out there right now. But the city elected to not go down that path, not go down the path of basically an industrial cell, which is much less restrictive on, or less restrictive. It's looser, they don't have the liner requirements. So this is the exact same liner that finally got put in at Summit County landfill 3 years ago. They were in line for 30 years or whatever. This is the same liner that is in every Class 1 facility in the counties, Salt Lake County, Utah County, the facilities in Tooele County that you would be hauling to. 2 of the facilities out there are the exact same component. So it's not like hauling it somewhere else is providing the environment a much better solution. So, did I miss anything?
No, thanks, Brenda. I mean, I think,
Sorry.
yeah.
Can you point, please, to
Okay,
the
bubble.
water treatment plant?
Water treatment plant's down here, and not that I want to steal Clint's thunder, but
Go for it.
this is the Gordo facility, this is the water treatment plant. They don't get their water from this. This is just happens to be uphill. Water for this comes from here, it comes from Rockport, right? Gets wheeled.
Just from Rockport.
Just Rockport?
Just
Raw
Rockport.
water from
So
Rockport.
that building right there receives water that's pumped from Rockport Reservoir, comes in at almost 200 PSI in a welded plastic line and is treated. So that, it's not connected in really any way to the surrounding. It gets its water source from 10-ish miles away.
Right.
So we're very confident in the science behind this, and one of the requirements is monitoring of groundwater and insurance that groundwater will be maintained and not be tainted in any capacity. And so one thing about this facility is it's upland. I thought we were gonna dig like a big giant 30, 60-foot hole, whatever. It's not a very deep facility because we hit bedrock after about 25 feet. And then we have a ton of bedrock till you get all the way down to 248. And then you've got a ditch and pavement and then quite a bit of distance from the stream. And then there's a 30-year monitoring requirement for the groundwater around the facility. We have to dig how many wells?
So it's a post-closure care requirement, so you have to put in 1 up-gradient well, 2 down-gradient wells, and start sampling those prior to accepting waste to determine what the background water quality is. However, in this instance, we'll be installing wells in the direct area where you've had 35,000 yards of contaminated soil already on site. So if anything, you would expect it to clean up over time because that existing waste that's on the ground gets put in the cell. So 1 up gradient, 2 down gradient, you do 8 rounds of sampling the first year to determine the water quality between wells. And then once you establish that, then you look at the water quality within the wells moving forward. This facility also is a finite life depending on how the city wants to operate it. It could be open anywhere from 2 years to 10 years, but it's not a huge amount of time. The sampling that you were talking about is 30 years post-closure. So for every one of these types of facilities, you have to maintain that sampling for 30 years post-closure to demonstrate that there's no impact to the environment.
And per the requirements of the permitting process, the city has already essentially bonded or committed the funds to do that sampling and testing for 30 years.
Yeah, you have to before you can open a facility. You have to show financial assurance in the shape of a insurance, a bond, or cash put aside that can only be accessed from the DEQ.
So while we're on the topic of groundwater, this has nothing to do with Gordo, what I'm about to say. I think there's a lot of talk about, wow, our town is covered in mining waste. I think that could raise concern about our wells where it is within our source protection zone, but I just want to say that we do monitor those regularly, and we do not detect metals in our wells. So, as a kind of a side impact from this conversation, people could be concerned about water quality from other sources that are not even near this. And I just want to let folks know that we do monitor regularly. And, in addition to the lead and arsenic, we're looking at things like antimony, thallium, zinc, cadmium, mercury. We test for a sweep, and we're not really seeing any levels in our groundwater wells. And we're drawing that water from aquifers directly below the mine tailings that Brett just showed in that photo. So again, just level of comfort that I think the community should take, not associated with groundwater, but there's a lot of discussion about this, and I think we just need to make sure we highlight that.
Would you also take responsibility for all the earthwork going on at the site and explain what that really is? And it's not.
Oh, you want me to take responsibility? No. You're talking Gordo?
Yeah, you're hauling soils out there.
There's activity there happening. One, there's a facility that Public Works uses for dumping the tank that the street sweeper picks up and the vac truck picks up. And we segregate all the water and let it evaporate. It's in a contained area. We stockpile material out there, and we're also almost done with this, but we were stockpiling some clay, some imported clay using to line the golf course ponds so they don't leak. We had to put it there. The contractor just wanted to have it on, nearby, so that once it was time to line the ponds, they could do it quickly. And we're removing that. We made, I don't know what layer we put down, but we put down a layer, put the dirt on top of that, just so we could guarantee that we weren't disturbing the cap or anything below on the existing site. So that's generally what's happening out there is, operational activities day-to-day with Public Works, and we're stockpiling clay for the golf course ponds.
So to pivot away from groundwater, and before I talk about other dangers of lead, which is really about wind and dust and airborne, I think it's worth reminding everybody, council hasn't made any decisions. They asked us to conduct this feasibility work with the UDEQ and the permitting, but again, they're very much going through an open engagement process with community and stakeholders. So their first next meeting is on the 15th of July. That'll be, the third public hearing I think we've had on this. But that's really where they're gonna dig into the discussion, they're gonna dig into what they've heard and the questions we're asking, and really assign next steps to staff. I think they will consider some options.
Let me, though, I don't mean to interrupt you necessarily, but to that point, as you're saying that, I think it's been really interesting, for those of you who've been following this, fairly closely over the last few weeks, it's kind of like, what? The city is moving along, merrily doing this, and all of a sudden they're doing this public input thing, and they're not making decisions, and what's going on, it's a little bit wompy, right? It's felt a little wompy-jawed in a way. And I think part of it, honestly, for us as staff is because we have worked through all of this internally, right, around safety and issues of how do you transport soils, and is that an issue, right, like a safety issue, and it was such a non-issue from our perspective at the staff level because these things have happened so much historically in Park City over time that we were a little, I think, taken aback by how that was raised as a concern, because for anybody who's lived here knows, or even if you haven't, people have been doing construction projects in the Park City area for decades, putting these types of soils in trucks, hauling that soil along 248 or along 224, for decades. And so those sort of procedures and practices and safety concerns have been addressed and have been something that's been part of the, I don't know, for lack of a better term, the fabric of how the city regulates and the city does business itself, regulates people who are doing it on the private side and then does it itself moving forward. And so I guess I wouldn't want people to be thinking that, whoa, all these questions are coming up now and were never answered. This is something that's been done for a long time, and we're just sort of backing into trying to explain it better in a way, I think, to the public who, of course, if you're not in the construction business, you don't know what the construction mitigation plan is for a construction site where they're digging out soils. Like, why would you? So we're working through our way of communicating best out to people those practices, those really standard safety things that are in play and have been instituted over many, many years for these types of projects from that sort of construction/transportation side, right?
Yeah, and those exactly address the primary routes that lead, if you're not gonna eat lead, which
Try not
you're
to.
not gonna eat lead, the other potential route is airborne. And so again, these construction mitigation plans, these best practices, they happen at the construction sites. They happen on how dirt is stored at construction sites, how it's loaded into vehicles, how it's covered in vehicles when en route, and then how it's tipped out at the other end. The city will own and operate the landfill the entire time and very much be in charge of accepting the dirt, ensuring that it's non-hazardous, that it's only mining influenced dirt, and then ensuring that the dirt, when it's at the site of the landfill, doesn't become airborne. And that's through a series of efforts that include watering and covering and tilling over dirt and making sure the roads are clean and everything else. We'll be cleaning the roads along the way as it gets transported as well. So these are very standard best practices along the way. It's important to note that, again, while the EPA and the UDEQ is responsible for the health and environmental safety of all of us, the Summit County Health Department isn't responsible for it. Who ends up practicing it every day is our local building official. They're are in charge of the day-to-day enforcement. And I've been working at the city for 22 years, and God forbid I get out of line with the local building official. I've had my own projects and city projects shut down before for little tiny things. They take this very seriously. If you guys have been around while we excavated up at the Montage in Upper Empire, you remember that they had surprise inspections and testing along trucks as they came down the mine road. They pulled them over, they made sure it was their dirt, they made sure their tarps were accurate and tight and good. And we're gonna go through all those same things on this. And I think we as a staff feel very comfortable in the plan. This is something that happens every day here. And again, to David's point, we just haven't really had a chance to communicate all those details. And council will start to ingest that, for lack of a better term, on the 15th. So.
So I had one more thing on this project. You have to call this a landfill because it falls within regulations at the state. So every other class 1 landfill in the state is used for municipal solid waste. So you have everything from baby diapers to whatever else, household hazardous waste, everything else. This is technically a landfill because it falls under those regulations. However, this is more like a highway embankment. So for the city to use this property in the end for beneficial use, once it comes to final elevation, it has to be put in a controlled state. So it needs to be moisture conditioned, it needs to be compacted, it needs to be tested. So from that standpoint, this isn't like dropping dry dirt in and walking away. This material, if it's not preconditioned at the site, whatever the site is, the 35,000 on yard, obviously, on site, it is what it is. But all that material has to be moisture conditioned to appropriately compact it so that there's not settlement issues in the future. So it's completely different than any other class 1 landfill that you'll ever see. It's a highway embankment.
No diapers.
No.
No diapers. Okay. Sir, you in the back, you came in after we introduced our, sorry, you come in
I
after
think
we,
the public's point of view,
can you just introduce yourselves? We did
Ben
a,
Nitka, resident here, my wife, her family have been here since the 50s and 60s, so we're not new. My wife was born in Salt Lake, I moved here full-time. They owned a house at 1119 Park Avenue back in the 60s for about $2,000. Is that enough credential?
that wasn't, one was needed,
So,
but that's great.
I think what's wonky, when you start saying wonky to the general public, is that Richardson Flat was identified, for the most part, as being a toxic waste type site. And I think most people didn't know about these other sites that you're identifying now. So the question becomes, is what else is being hid here that we don't know about, that you've moved dirt to, that is not generally known? And now all of a sudden, out of the blue, this becomes an issue because you want to develop the Bonanza property. It wasn't because you wanted to protect us from this other site next to the Osgothorpe conservation easement. I think that's the site you're talking about, is we paid money for a conservation easement over Osgothorpe thinking we're keeping a pristine site, and now we're getting told that right next door, which was never told to us, are dump sites. So I think that's where it starts getting wonky for the general public. And I think, in all honesty, those sites should have been identified before, and now that they are there any more? In complete honesty.
Are there any more sites that might be used?
That have been used,
That have been
that are being
used?
stored, that are not identified. Other than everybody here knew Richardson Flats.
Right.
Nobody was going out there with their kids. Nobody was taking their grandkids there to play, because everybody knew that it was toxic. You wouldn't, maybe you got sick, maybe you didn't. You got plenty of people that say they never got sick doing this, that, or the other. That's what the problem is.
Right.
I think that's what you gotta overcome.
I very much appreciate that perspective. From everything that I've learned in dealing with this issue for the last 18 months, I can say I am not aware of any other location where the city has been storing soils in anticipation of a permanent solution. Only at this Gordo site where this 35,000 cubic yards exists. And that's what's in part, made the Gordo site attractive for the permanent solution, because those soils are already there, it's already a disturbed area. How do we get those soils into the belt suspenders, really state-of-the-art facility instead of them just sitting on the ground as they are now? So that's part of the the evaluation that went into why thinking the Gordo site on a limited basis made sense to handle this material.
Yeah, I would reinforce that, Dave, is, again, we were hauling dirt. Let me take a step back. So in 1982 or 83, the EPA came to town, and they said, Silver Creek Watershed, top to bottom, is polluted. We've got problems. And they put in 5 or 6 Superfund sites. Prospector neighborhood fell just short of actually becoming a Superfund site. The reason it didn't is because the city worked with the feds to create this yellow district, the soils ordinance boundary. And what we did with that is we said everything from this boundary is gonna either stay in the boundary and be capped with 6 inches of topsoil, or it's gonna be hauled to an appropriate landfill. And in doing that, an appropriate landfill was always Richardson Flat. And then it got taken away from us, but we had a bunch of soil, and we agreed with the UDEQ to store it immediately across the street here, because the hope was we could quickly get an agreement between the mines company, the federal government, work with Summit County to just bring it back here. And it was the shortest distance we could find, so we didn't incur massive additional hauling costs. So we did have permission or acknowledgement from the UDEQ. It was gonna be there. As far as I know, in all the research I've done in all the 20 years that I've been here, no dirt. The city has no dirt anywhere else but here. And the only dirt that's dealing with this bevel exemption is the dirt that's come from this boundary here. And the big first one was the transit center where the Marsac Mill is, right below City Hall. That was a massive exposure, a massive amount of dirt that we had to put, and most of it's capped on site at the actual Marsac Mill site, which is where the transit center is. So I think one thing that is worth mentioning and reminding people, at our Park City Heights meeting, Seth, your neighbor, Patty, said, why don't you put it up at like Deer Valley, or why don't you put it somewhere else? The fact of the matter is, the way the deal was we made with the feds in '83 was any dirt that comes out of this district, if it's not capped on site, has to stay within the boundary of the yellow line. And so this is within the soils boundary. I don't know if that helps or that answers your question, but Andy, you've been doing this as long as I have.
I'll add
Well,
to that.
I have a question based on what Ben brought up. You said, okay, Richardson Flats is closed down, but what does that really mean? I think, if you want to say the public doesn't remember why Richardson Flats is not a place we can put it.
So here's the answer. So we've heard that Richardson Flat has capacity for somewhere between 1.5 to 3 million more cubic yards of bevel soils. The reason it became closed to us, and my glasses, is the mines company worked out with the federal government that they were gonna take all this downstream contamination and put it here. And in doing so, precluded upstream from going into it. Simple answer.
So not in my backyard, you got it. We're capped, it's
They
full.
believe there's enough capacity here to fill that remaining capacity that they have
And
here.
they haven't done it yet, so it's just sitting there still, right?
My understanding is there's 1.5 million tons in what they call OU2 and OU3, which is the Silver Creek Watershed, that the county has been in negotiations with the EPA for a solution, and that's what they're reserving the space in the landfill. Now, I will go a step farther and say currently the landfill's a mess because it's operating, it's owned by United Park City Mines, who is bankrupt and is in lawsuits with the EPA. So it is just stranded there with nothing happening right now, which is if we want to be concerned about something, that's what I'd be concerned about, is a lack of monitoring on that. But it has I'm 9.5 years on council, and maybe a year before I got on council, the EPA had shut down the landfill, and we have had constant conversations with them about how we could have access with it, and they have not been receptive for political and practical reasons. So I think why we ended up at Gordo was finally this particular council said, we keep kicking this can down the road. It was supposed to be solved 8-9 years ago. We got to do something proactive. What are the options? And that's how we ended up here. And You know, if this doesn't work, then we'll look at the next phase of options, but there aren't a lot. Everything we wanna do has social and environmental impacts and cost impacts. And there are no easy answers for this one. And that's why we're having the tough conversations.
And I'll just add, running a department that operates underground, a lot of stuff is buried. One thing that you didn't mention is just, we're not stockpiling anything, looking for a permanent solution. The stuff we generate either goes back in the hole or we drive it to Tooele. And it's about twice the cost as local disposal. So, I've been in front of Andy and Max a few times asking for more money because we hit soil and we have to haul it to Tooele, and it adds a lot of expense. All the water, the dirt that came out of one of the ponds on the golf course, right onto the truck, straight to Tooele. So, there's no little stashes around town that I know of either. It's just to Tooele since 2010.
Joy?
My question really stems from the existing temporary landfill that you've referenced. What monitoring is going around for that project? Is there any? Because I think it would make people feel a lot better about it, knowing that what impact that may have had on the community. Because if it's had no impact in the in the structure it's in, and it's going into a better impact, in a better contained area, then we're all looking golden here.
So what we do know is that the dirt that we have out there, the 35,000, while it's not sitting on a liner, it has been capped appropriately, and the UDEQ has come out and certified that it's been capped appropriately. So when you see a swirl of dust or whatever, it's fresh topsoil that would meet the standards that the Prospector neighborhood has. It's tested regularly to ensure that the cap hasn't been compromised, or a badger hasn't dug a hole in it, or that there's not water running off that's running through mine impacted soils. So, Patty and I have talked at length about, the dirt blowing off that hill, and if that's a cause of alarm. My belief is because the cap has maintained its integrity and is tested regularly, that's certainly not a concern.
There's no groundwater monitoring. That's the first thing I looked at too. It's like, oh, this would be great. And actually, we went out there and were able to drill. Well, we did several test pits to understand where this bedrock was. That determines how deep you can go and stuff like that. And we were able to drill one boring because that was the first thing I was looking at. It's like, all right, let's see where the water is. And based on the hydrogeology of the area, you wouldn't expect any water whatsoever except one thing, the upstream alfalfa farm, right? Didn't really even look at that like that was going to be a source of anything, but apparently it's over the years gone down and hit an aquiclude or aquitard. So there is some water beneath the site, so that we can actually sample it and measure it moving forward. At first, I didn't think it was going to be practical to have any water under the site. So in the future, there should be a way to monitor it.
So the entire water table that exists there is because most likely of the irrigation happening on the fields next to it.
Most likely. I mean, it's not a great big basin where you look at a whole hillside where the snow's sitting and you go, I'll bet that's infiltrating, going down into groundwater, rather it goes off as surface water. So that was one surprise.
And I'll add, I get paranoid about messaging because we work hard to convince people our water is good. We do have soils like this over our drinking water wells. We do monitor those wells, and like I said, we're not picking up any metals in those of any significant value.
Yeah, right? And yet, right?
That's
So,
correct.
so the question that keeps coming to me is the simple one, and it stems from something that I feel coming from you and something that Jillian brings up, which is, what's the safest option for soil? And where do you want your soil, right? So it's not in the wells yet, right? But the soil that we're talking about moving is over where our drinking water comes from, and there's no liner underneath it. It's not mitigated in any way, shape, or form. If we take it from there and put it somewhere where it's not over the water that's coming to us, is that safer? Is that better long-term for public health? And then it's really a conversation about when it moves, how it moves, et cetera. We've kind of hit on all those things that we've been moving it at different times of day in different ways for my entire life as I've lived here. Proximity to where the population is, right? That's why we're out here with you guys right now. I look at the one that's right next to Park City Heights. I think about the safety of the airborne contamination, and from everything that I've heard in all of these listening sessions, you know, if you mitigate that potential risk, it's relatively low, and that's going to happen one way or the other. These soils are going to end up on our roads moving somewhere. They're either going to move a couple miles down the same road, by the way, to get to Tooele. We're going to add 1 million, was it 1 million miles, truck miles? I think when we had that conversation.
It's a staggering amount.
It was staggering. I mean, it blew our mind how many extra miles of just truck miles it's going to be on highways running past all the communities between here and Tooele. And we have a site that right now isn't lined underneath. Now it's capped, but even if you just took that one and flipped it into the new repository, that's safer, right? So we're going for safer here. We're going for safer from where it's over the water table to here. And when it comes down to the conversation we're all having is, what's the safest option? And you brought it up earlier, Jonathan. Socially, economically, and environmentally, this checks all the boxes. And this isn't a sales pitch. This is just, I'm just trying to think about it from your perspective. Been here a long time. What would you prefer? The safest option, right? And the most transparent process possible. I'm having a hard time finding where, I mean, we can try and find more problems, but this is why staff has been sort of surprised, because we've been through this over and over and over, and this is the best option that we have ever seen in terms of soil mitigation in Park City. The best we've ever seen. So when we're out here in the public talking about it, I keep coming to these things hoping for that thing that's like, oh, that's why everybody's freaked out. They're freaked out because they don't know, but this is the best that we've ever seen. And if I'm missing something, then that's why I keep coming. What am I missing?
This isn't saying you're missing something, as you're talking about transportation and all that. And we've met a number of times, so we've brought up a number of points over time. One point that your statement just brought up is that 35,000 yards of material, if it has to move, depending on the size of the truck, will be 3,000 or 4,000 truckloads leaving the site. So that just brought that up. So sorry to interrupt.
Patty, why don't you ask some questions that we talked about?
One of my concerns was about wording, and Jonathan and I have gone through it a number of times, is, I'm not what it's sure it's called, but in the WDEQ section of code or whatever, it says it can't be within 1,000 feet of a recreation area. Yet we have a trail system there. But supposedly somebody said that a recreation trail is not recreation, it's a surface improvement.
Yeah.
So I use that trail a lot, and I think Jonathan put trail counters on there to see the use. And we've talked about breathing from there, using that trail a lot. Brief exposure, long-term exposure. But to me, if there's a regulation says not within 1,000 feet, but it's all words. A trail is recreation, but for this, a trail is a surface improvement. So if that was considered a trail, then you couldn't build that there. So that's just, to me, sounds kind of funny, because it's all based on a word.
So I've got the answer to that, and I think we talked briefly at the Park City Heights meeting. So the way this project developed, again, it was moving that cell around, and there was initial screening because you don't want to get too far down a process and then have there be a fatal flaw, and you've already put groundwater wells in or bought equipment or something like that. So as part of the process, I had the DEQ the site for that very reason. It's like, I want some clarity on a few things. So the issues on, well, the people that were on site were this Brian Spears, who now runs the solid waste group, the Al Moore, who was the gentleman that just retired from it, and this Doug Taylor, who is the regulator. And that question was specifically asked, what do you guys consider recreation? Is it trails? Is it the, what is it? And the answer was, it's specifically a developed area, because what they found in other areas is that these trails go everywhere, and depending on where they're located, that may preclude, or it may not preclude, it just means you have to ask for an exemption. So that was specifically asked of them standing on site, like, this is what we have, and that was their answer to me. So we didn't move past the initial screening until I got that answer from the DEQ.
So are we asking for an exemption, or they're still saying it's a building versus a open trail?
So we're good on the rec, right? Because the DEQ said through the public comment period in their responses, they haven't asked us to further clarify. So they've determined that it's a developed recreation area. But the same logic applies to the stream requirement. There's a 1,000-foot requirement distance from a stream.
Is this the Silver Creek they were talking about? Can you go, because I didn't hear what were the critics of the Silver Creek being?
Well, again, we're within 1,000 feet. And so we will have to talk to council about an exception next time we talk to them. They haven't been informed of that outside of anecdotally, like in these settings. And so we, as a staff, don't have the authority to pursue that exemption request. Only council can decide if they want to do that. So they'll need to do that in a public setting where they...
Where is that on the map? Can you show, or is it?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to.
So it's also, it goes right down the center of the contaminated area, since it was the source of it.
And I just wanted to clean that up to add on the 13th, you'll have Ryan from DEQ participating.
You need the Silver Creek.
On the 13th.
On the
Or
13th.
Silver Creek. Yeah, but I mean, does it show there? Okay.
So again, when Brett first started to lay out this facility, it was tucked up in here. We were focused on the 35,000, and it met the distance requirements to the Silver Creek stream. And as we got to talking to him and trying to figure out how to keep public works in here, and then we started to really cite what could be the future of Recycle Utah, these cells pushed down. And then we said, well, heck, we're designing the repository. We should really think about other future city projects while we're here, and give council some options on whether we want to do beyond just the 35. So 35 pushed here, and then we built, and again, concept design, what we applied for with the UDEQ, a second cell. And as we did that and really started to grade out the berming so it wouldn't have a visual terracing effect, we just relied on natural grade to tie into the bottom, we got into that 1,000-foot area. Brett had already talked to the UDEQ. They already thought it was worth applying for. It wasn't clear to me that we needed an exception request, or I certainly would have informed council of that before we hit the apply button. So that's on me. So it's on me to take it to the city council on the 15th and make sure they're clear of that. And then if we are gonna take next steps through our UDEQ permitting process, we will have to apply for the exemption. We have no reason to believe from talking to the UDEQ, again, we're quite confident that they like this project, because again, we've had 35,000 cubic yards out there on a temporary okay from them for 10 years, and they're excited about the idea of putting it in an appropriate facility.
So where is the creek on there?
Well, this Matt always tells me that, like, it's...
Oh, so it's crossed
It's
248. Okay.
Yeah, right here. That's why I was grabbing the other one. It's sort of hard to see on that, but yeah.
On the other side of the water.
And so I've been asked to give a real number, well, it's like 518 feet here and 537 feet here. So I mean, we're probably gonna assign a range of that distance as we go through that exemption process. And again, only the city council has the authority to allow us to apply or ask for that. And that's one thing they'll have to consider. They may ask us to do that so we complete, again, our permitting process over here, but they are still, as the owner, gonna retain the right to proceed with the process as the owner, right? Even if we get a UDEQ permit, that doesn't mean we have to fill the permit, right? And so we also have to go to the planning commission for a conditional use. That's another process we'll be doing as we work with Recycle Utah to further our site planning. If this goes forward, we'll end up with the planning commission for a master plan development and a subdivision process. So there's lots of public hearings and work in the future. And those are regulatory land use processes that are in the planning department, the city council as the owner still is going through this owner's process. Again, that'll restart or recommit itself on the 15th of July.
Can I add one thing to that? How about two
I'll
things?
get them.
You're going to Bear Lake. So one of the reasons having a permit in your back pocket is very important. I've got a number of clients. I've been doing this for years along the Wasatch Front. And I've got a number of clients that have permitted for facilities, because what that does is if you negotiate with someone else to eventually haul material out, they know you have an option. So every one of my clients that have done this, and not all of them develop landfills, they've done it to improve their position on ultimate waste handling. So a number of clients that I've got have permitted facilities, and the for-profit Class 1 landfills in the area that you could take this stuff to, or in their case, it's actually municipal solid waste. As soon as they have that permit option in their back pocket, then the people that would accept the waste get a little more serious about providing. It's not a monopoly anymore. They have to be able to provide disposal at a cost that is realistic, because the default for these clients has always been, if you're not going to do that, then we will build our own facility. So even more than just for this particular project, it's leverage for the city moving forward, on whatever avenue, right?
Thanks, Brett.
So if the ice rink was in 1,000 feet of this landfill, would that eliminate the project?
We would have to decide if we wanted to apply for an exemption.
So doesn't that say something's unhealthy if you can't build it within 1,000 feet of something?
I don't know, Patty, I guess I'm a career bureaucrat, and if the UDEQ and the EPA set up a standard, then, you know, they're issuing a permit based on their belief on effects on human health, environmental safety.
In the exception rules, I was gonna say to Brad, is there are exception rules, and they look at it, they look at the design. I've been in discussions with Brad about this and looking at the permit rules and what it entails. And usually if they may come back and want a higher level of design, right, to protect people or the groundwater or the environment. And in the case of a stream, the exception would be, does it need to be designed different to protect the water? And where Brett can talk more about the design, but I think our design is above and beyond what they would consider as necessary. I mean, we could have gone out and applied for a different
type of permit. Also, when you read those regulations, municipal solid waste is what these facilities are used for 99.9% of the time. So you're talking about methane gas generation and what that may look like, you know, in the environment. That also pressurizes the landfill, so you also may get vapor phase transport of stuff. You may get blowing litter. So there's a number of things associated with MSW facilities that those regulations are written for. Like I say, you rarely see that application with soil. So a lot of the problems that you see, potentially odors, right, with a landfill, blowing issues. You'll get also vermin, you'll get seagulls, you'll get all sorts of other things. So a lot of these things, or all of them, were developed from that perspective, not from landfilling soil.
Something that gets lost too is the question that you're asking is a valid one, but there is zero chance they would let us put it where it is now, the way it is now. It's in the center of town, right next to the busiest roads in town, across the street from the cemetery, right between all the food and beverage places where people are walking and talking. There's no way they'd let us leave it there if it weren't already there. So again, it's a safer place for it to be for public health purposes than where it is right now. There's an improvement happening rather than and that's just, I mean, we could just leave it with concrete over it and not touch it, but anything that happens there, the soil's gonna get moved and it has to be mitigated in some way or another. there's no way they would let us leave it the way it is right now if we were trying to move it from somewhere else and put it there. You know, I mean, that's kind of, it's really close to a lot of recreation right now. It's got trails all around it, so.
Back to the elevation, I remember at the Park City meeting, there was the guy with the, was that ever figured out and what it's gonna look like from the road?
So two things on that. One, and you can see on this is conceptual. So this, you have to come up with a conceptual plan for the UDEQ. You put a little bit higher slope on them, so that way when you model a seismic event, then the steeper the slope, the more, likely it is for failure. So for modeling, you do that. You do this also for stormwater calculations, what you do with stormwater. This is in no way, shape, or form what will be built there. It's a conceptual presentation to the DEQ to show that you've looked at seismic issues and runoff issues. And then also to be able to come up with an area for financial assurance so that the city puts away money. Also, what this is, it is above this existing ground, but what is out there right now is above existing ground. So this largely matches the pile of soil out there elevation-wise. So the city has done some renderings of what it would look like. But again, this is for permitting purposes. Every one of these construction projects with the DEQ has to be approved by them. Well, and one, it's got to go through planning and zoning. So I've asked the city a number of times, what are you going to do with this property? And all we came up with is we want to use it in the future, so it has to be put in a compacted state. So it's just conceptual. That doesn't make sense for me.
So what we see now, it won't get any higher than that?
No, that's what this is what it's matching. Within 5 feet, I think.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to leave in a few minutes. So if anybody have any questions I can answer.
My water bill.
I just want to make a comment, I came here to be educated and I could just sort of envision for every perception I had, I heard a clear answer. And there are a lot of perceptions around. You see them in the letters to the editors. So if there could be some kind of handout that said perception and then what the truth was, what the answer was, perception, answer, that would really help me to, to kind of net out what we've said today.
I think council would agree with you. I don't do any social media, and I think we're all struggling. Is like, where does the bleeding stop? And I'd love to hear more thoughts. Because I can address things that I get in settings like this. It's really helpful. We can answer online. We know kind of what the enemy is, but there's a lot of misinformation. I heard a lot of it on the radio yesterday morning. I couldn't believe what was being said by someone I thought was pretty informed. A lot of really, it seemed intentional misinformation. I didn't understand. So we're doing our best on the 15th to bring a series of kind of concise technical documents to address dust, to address construction mitigation, to address human health hazards. They're written by experts and attorneys. And I don't know if it's going to help or not. I keep getting input. I come to these, and I had a little cold for a while, and I like it. But you're not being concise in your answers, Jonathan, like you want to do better. And it's like, I'm struggling to know what the enemy is a little bit. So I'd love your advice on.
Well, worse than that, Lily keeps asking me, and I'm like, I'm talking as slowly and as loudly as I can. I just can't.
But thank you for saying that, because we are focused on that as well, and it's nice to get that validation, because each time we do this, our way of presenting it evolves a little bit, so thank you for that.
A really simple fact sheet, like she said.
Yeah.
That doesn't go, the way you talk, that goes.
Well, and if you heard me on the radio the other day, I was trying not to get into liner stuff, and I'm just like, because if I do this, it's not going to be meaningful at all, and it's like, yeah, sorry. But yeah.
It's kind of taking like a lot of the critics from Tuesday night, kind of deciphering what they were asking and what is your
Yeah,
fact?
one of the things that I've been hearing is like you don't really know, and like we're trying not to have this landfill, as Max describes it, which we think is a really good, positive project, and have it become like this proxy for the arts and culture district, which is a completely different conversation. A lot of the criticism we're getting is you don't know about the dirt at the art and culture district, but we do. We have very detailed environmental reports, and we know exactly how good or how bad it is and what it's gonna take. We know exactly how we're gonna separate any potential of hazardous dirt from our bevel exemptor. We feel very confident in our ability to do that. If it just gets to be this awkward and misinformed conversation, it's hard. Please.
Just out of curiosity, what happens after 30 years as far as monitoring and second, what exactly, when you keep saying you're gonna get insurance or bonding, how do they pay? I mean, insurance companies are notorious for finding a reason not to pay, not to bail us out in a sense after paying for this protection. And then the other thing is, I won't be around, but I'm curious, and it won't be the same city council or mayor, and somebody's gonna go like this in 30 years about what do we do now? So I'm just curious.
I'll take my best swing at it. So this all came about with Subtitle D regulations back in '93. So a lot of these facilities, if you're dealing with a pretty short history of that, there's only been 1 or 2 facilities in Utah that have even gone through to the post-closure care period of these. But what they're seeing is that, and these are, again, this is back to the municipal solid waste, which does produce methane, it does decompose, there are a number of things that happen with it, completely different than a soil embankment. But what they're seeing is when they cut them off from the environment, in essence, water, then the whole thing stabilizes. It stabilizes, and they haven't seen any impacts on those, but there's only a couple of facilities that have gone that way. And then to your question about the financial assurance, so this isn't up to the city specifically to make their own policy for a bond or financial assurance. It's very specific from the state to address exactly what you're talking about, that there's no wiggle room. And if it's money put aside, the city can't access it. It can only be accessed from the DEQ. So it's very put in a box, and there's not wiggle room, and it's not up to insurance companies in the future. It's a really tight process that, again, I see this all the time with clients I deal with, especially rural counties, right? So they want to put some money away, and every year the sheriff department needs a new, sheriff's vehicle, and they're coming to try and raid these funds that are put away, and the smarter counties will put them in these limited, very limited type of accounts, so they can't get raided by their own governmental agency. Not that Park City would, but.
Well, and this will be just like any other facility that we own. So whether it's our ice rink or whether it's City Hall, we'll have to have an insurance policy that covers it. And this will be a different type of insurance, but our broker, Morton, who it is right now, would have to go get that rider for this type of facility. So it'll just be part of our profile, part of our assets.
So one thing I wanted to just circle back and drive home on this is we could very easily burn this. We could keep it in place, put it in piles, and put a cap on it, like is done all over town. That's historically what's done with a lot of these soils. They're tested, the toxic part is taken out to Tooele, and then the remaining mine legacy is left on site because that's the cheapest solution. It's not lined, it has, it just has a topsoil cap, and it sits there over the aquifer or our watershed. And so really what the reason City Council is even entertaining this is because we thought we could do something that is gonna be safer and healthier and a long-term solution for our community. So one way or another, we have a town that sits on top of capped soil that doesn't have a liner on it. Those caps, we do a degree of testing, but it's everywhere. So it's hard to know whether those caps have been penetrated, whether people have gone and put fence posts on them and such. But the reason City Council wanted to look at this is because we felt like it was this very, very safe way to deal with these soils in the long term. So whether we hit the mark or not, that's up to all you decide, but this was an attempt to improve public health and safety, or is an attempt to improve public health and safety.
That's a huge message, huge message.
Yeah, don't forget it's an election year, and there are some, you gotta do your research on who's giving you the message and why they might be giving it.
And we do have a Engage Park City page up and running. It's got way more than you'd probably want to read, but a lot of documents up there. The environmental limited site analysis at arts and culture, for instance. It's got all the plans and everything. And the most important document, actually, in my mind, is the city's application to the DEQ for this facility. It has a ton of really well-articulated information about operations and maintenance and blah, blah, blah. And it's really, every time I read it, I'm like, oh, well, all the answers are right here, you know, like, and so, worst comes to worst, you get really bored and you wanna be the expert, that's the document you read.
No, you don't want to read it. It was pointed out the other night, 346 pages. I'll say this in closing, though. The UDEQ told me that this is the single most responsible thing they've seen out of Park City in 30 years to address the soils. Period.
I'm not sure how to take that. Does that mean
I
we've
know.
been really irresponsible until now?
It's
or-
like, and it's like, boy, I like your haircut. Does that mean that you didn't like it before?
Exactly.